History proclaims Napoleon as one of the greatest generals in the annals of warfare. His strategic vision, timing, and his consummate grasp of every one of the variables which influenced the behavior of a vast army have made him a legendary figure to rank alongside Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Hannibal. Napoleon was crowned Emperor of France by his own hand in a ceremony of great pomp and circumstance on the 2nd of December, 1804. His moment of supreme glory came from a rapid series of promotions, which had seen him move from a little-known captain of artillery to undisputed master of France in only 6 years.
Napoleon had an almost meteoric rise to fame. I think we can understand this best if we imagine the French Revolution giving young officers in the French army what we would now term a real window of opportunity. Napoleon was skilled and talented, but beyond that he had great ambition and a sense of his own destiny.
Napoleon accepted that war would become an integral part of his life and that of his country. Without interruption for almost 20 years from the rise of Napoleon to his forced abdication, the awful spectre of war hovered somewhere over the continent. The French Revolution provided him with his first taste of action, and it was to profoundly influence his outlook on life. Between old monarchs and a young republic, a spirit of hostility must always exist. In the present state of affairs, every peace treaty means no more than a brief armistice, but I believe that my destiny will be to fight almost continuously.
With the French Revolution, which swept away the ancien regime with its very structured society and very structured military rank system, Napoleon had immense opportunity, which for an ambitious young officer, if he was willing to take those opportunities and grab them, make the most of them, a young officer could rise through the ranks very quickly. This was the start of his rise to fame.
Throughout his long career, Napoleon's implacable enemy was, as always, England. A nation which Napoleon detested with a passion. The English armies and navies had proved a constant thorn in the side of Napoleon, and his most spectacular defeats were at the hands of the British, a trend which began with Napoleon's ill-fated Egyptian campaign.
Egypt presented Napoleon Bonaparte with a romantic opportunity. Napoleon hoped that by taking Egypt, he would be able to hamper British control of the Mediterranean and possibly deal the British Empire a death blow. As it turned out, however, although he was able to seize power in Egypt after the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798, at the Battle of Abu Qir Bay in August of that year, Nelson was able to destroy the French fleet and effectively imprison the French army in Egypt. After an abortive attempt to seize Acre during 1799, Napoleon realized that the Egyptian campaign was effectively doomed, and he actually left the army of Egypt to its fate, returning to France and Paris in October 1798.
Memories of the disastrous naval battle of the Nile and Alexandria on land haunted Napoleon. His anger was kindled anew when Britain was instrumental in bringing together an international coalition against him. This new coalition, the third which had been created, was formed from Austria, Russia and Britain, and was pledged to destroy forever the destabilizing influence which a young revolutionary nation like France was thought to have on the old order. The hopes of the Third Coalition were further bolstered by the news that Prussia, who had been vacillating between actively joining the coalition and acting as a mediator for peace, was now more than likely to join the other nations in arms against Napoleon. This would bring a huge influx of men against the emperor and could well have made the situation untenable for him. In the early months of 1805, the strategic situation therefore looked very promising indeed for the nations of the Third Coalition. But what with the enemy, the Allies couldn't have predicted the sheer quality of this new Napoleonic army. Since 1800, France had been largely at peace, and Napoleon had completely restructured his military machine.
Napoleon had divided his army down into a whole series of what we might call miniature armies. These army corps numbered in terms of strength from approximately 15,000 men up to as many as 30 or even 40,000 men. But the advantage this gave was that each army corps was a balanced force, what we now call a proper battle group. It had its own cavalry, its own infantry, its own artillery, and above all it had its own staff. And a marshal commanding one of these corps really had his own miniature army under his command. Now what this meant, of course, was that if he ran into unexpected trouble, even against an enemy army of several times his own size, he was capable, by Napoleon's calculation, of fighting for up to 24 hours on his own. And provided he was reinforced within 24 hours by neighbouring corps, he would not absolutely go under. He'd suffer, but he would not go under.
Another advantage of the corps system was the flexibility and speed it gave to the French staff. Instead of, as with an 18th century army, Napoleon's chief of staff having to write out a separate set of orders for every regiment within the army, Napoleon could simply direct his corps commanders on their mission or objective. This made the French army far more responsive and flexible than the armies that Napoleon faced.
To defeat Napoleon in the campaign of 1805, the Third Coalition planned a series of 4 great offensives, each in a different part of Europe, which were planned to be launched simultaneously. In the north, a British force, aided by Swedish and Russian elements, would attack Napoleon's ally, the Kingdom of Denmark. The Austrian General Mack, with 85,000 Russian allies, would seize Ulm and then strike against Strasbourg. Archduke Charles, with 100,000 of the best Austrian troops available to him, was to strike into northern Italy and expel the French from Lombardy, before moving on to invade the south of France. Poised between Mack's force pressing onto Ulm and Archduke Charles's forces in Italy was the Austrian Archduke John, with a further 25,000 Austrians. They were ready to support the armies in either Germany or Italy, depending on how the situation developed. The final arm of this great master plan was a combined Russian and British force from Malta, who would strike northwards through Italy to join Archduke Charles in the invasion of southern France. If the plan was brilliant in its conception, it was to prove disastrous in its execution. Unbeknown to the Austrian chiefs of staff, the Russians were actually using the old-style Russian calendar, a different calendar from their allies.
In the early 19th century, there were still 2 calendar systems operating in Europe, and this was going to lead to a great deal of trouble. Russia, being a rather old-fashioned country, still kept on to the old-style dating system of the Julian calendar, which was 12 days different, though, from the new-style system adopted by almost all the rest of Europe, which was called the Gregorian calendar system. It is amazing that the Austrian General Staff in Vienna did not realize that there was this difference in the calendar system. Let's say that Russian allies with whom they were negotiating for their part in the campaign were working on a different calendar. So if a letter came from St. Petersburg promising to be in the Danube Valley by the 20th of October, it really meant they would only be appearing on the 1st of November, new style. And that could make a big difference in the actual military events on the ground, as you might suppose.
Despite the odds ranged against him, Napoleon was never a man to be overawed or intimidated. For him, a swift action with a clear strategic purpose could unhinge even the greatest disadvantage. In a masterpiece of surprise, cunning and deception, Napoleon was about to pull off his finest masterstroke. General Mack of Austria had occupied Ulm in Bavaria on the 10th of September 1805. Due to the inconsistency of the calendars, his Russian allies, under Kutuzov, were farther away than Mack imagined, leaving the Austrian general isolated around Ulm. Napoleon managed to fool the Austrians into believing that the bulk of the French forces were still concentrated on the English Channel, when in fact they were moving with lightning speed across the Rhine and could then encircle the Austrians at Ulm on the Danube and attack them from the rear. After some fierce fighting around Ulm and a variety of minor actions, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the situation of General Mack was hopeless. Faced with superior French forces, he held out in vain for the arrival of the Russians under Kutuzov. Kutuzov was still far beyond reach.
Even before Mack really realised what had happened, Napoleon had fixed his attention and manoeuvred his corps so that Mack was surrounded. The only alternative for Mack was then to surrender.
Napoleon is seen here accepting the surrender of the general, who referred to himself as the unfortunate General Mack. The odds against the emperor in the campaign overall were now considerably shorter. He now turned to deal with the remaining Russian and Austrian armies. The conclusive proof of his military genius was furnished for all time on the slopes of the frozen heights of Austerlitz on the 2nd of December 1805. As the famous blood-red sun of Austerlitz rose through the mist on the morning of this, his greatest battle, Napoleon was confident of victory. But even he could not have forecast just how complete his triumph would be.
Napoleon not only fooled the enemy as to the strength of numbers of troops he could put onto that battlefield, he also dictated to them the way they were to fight their battle, the area of his lines which they were to attack.
On the battlefield of Austerlitz, he actually surrendered the dominating Pratzen Heights. This again gave the Allies the impression that Napoleon was weak, that his force would not stand against their much larger formations.
But the Austrians thought they were being given the ideal chance to cut the main road running from Brno to Vienna, Napoleon's line of advance and also therefore his line of retreat or of communications, and then roll him up to the north and have him completely at their mercy.
Napoleon had arranged that one of his best corps commanders, Davout, was within marching distance of the battlefield, and in 24 hours before the actual battle, on the 1st of December 1805, Napoleon had managed to concentrate far more troops than the Allies believed he had under his command.
Austerlitz is one of the completest victories that Napoleon ever achieved. There is no doubt that this battle left Napoleon the master of southern Central Europe.
The emperor had deceived the Allies completely, and they had rushed headlong into his carefully laid traps. The enormity of the defeat on the field, however, was as nothing compared to its consequences. The following day, December the 3rd, Austria sued for peace, while the beaten, battered Russians limped away to the safety of Poland and Hungary, a thoroughly demoralized army. Napoleon had indelibly stamped his mark on the affairs and fortunes of Europe, offering an ominous portent of the bloodshed which would blight the continent for the next 10 years. Above all, it established the reputation of the Grande Armée as the most effective fighting force of its age. In many respects, Austerlitz represented the zenith of Napoleon's fame. The seeds of Napoleon's great misadventure of 1812 were sown in the uneasy treaty concluded in the wake of that victory between Prussia, Russia and France in July 1807. Peace had been reached after 2 years of struggle between France and the combined armies of Austria, Prussia and Russia, during which Napoleon had gained some of his most famous victories in a career of famous victories. With the signing of the treaty, the Emperor was finally able to coerce the Russians into joining his continental system, along with the equally reluctant Prussians.
Napoleon, as Emperor, was not just a soldier, he was Emperor and therefore the main representative of the government of France. And just as Napoleon exerted huge energy in his military campaigns, he also turned much of his attention as Emperor to the administration and running of France.
The continental system was designed to stimulate trade within Europe and to carry on war with England by economic means. England, as Napoleon's implacable foe, was to be excluded from all trade within continental Europe. Not surprisingly, the Russian Tsar Alexander I was a less than willing partner in a system which soon proved ruinous for many influential merchants and which drew him into an unlooked-for war with Great Britain, leading to a series of major devaluations of the ruble. Tension soon grew between the two countries and finally led to a declaration of war. French forces crossed the River Niemen into Russia in June 1812, and the long-expected war was finally begun. That year was 1812. The setting for what was to become one of the most spectacular military disasters in the history of warfare, the virtual destruction of the largest military machine the world had yet seen. In order to achieve the rapid subjugation of the Russians, Napoleon had assembled more than 650,000 men from every nation then under the sway of the French Empire. But Napoleon did not anticipate going beyond 50 miles into Russian Poland, because he felt that he would be able to force a decisive battle early in the campaign, which was always his objective. But he certainly was not prepared for a winter campaign, or one which stretched him all the way to Moscow.
Napoleon's original objectives were very limited in 1812. In fact, when he actually made his proclamation to the army, he said that they were about to launch the Second Polish Campaign. So what Napoleon was actually trying to do was not invade Russia, and certainly not go as far as Moscow. What he intended to do was to trap a large number of Russian soldiers, if possible wipe out their whole armies in the west, and remove Russia's military power, so that he could actually lay down the terms at a peace treaty which would once and for all establish himself as the leader of Europe and remove the Tsar Alexander and the Russian army as a threat for the foreseeable future.
In a dispatch to Davout, Napoleon summed up his strategy with the words, "The aim of all my moves will be to concentrate 400,000 men at a single point." The Russian grand strategy was always to draw the French armies deeper into Russia and further away from their supply bases, where hunger, cold and disease would gnaw away at the bones of the great army.
When Napoleon's armies crossed the Niemen River on the 24th of June 1812, Napoleon believed and hoped that he would be able to trap and capture the main Russian armies very close to the frontier. However, in a series of battles, starting with the actions around Vilna in June, then around the Dvina River in July, and finally around Smolensk in August, Napoleon was unable to trap the now retreating Russian armies. This meant that Napoleon was drawn further and further into Russia without achieving the decisive battle which he sought.
The Russian withdrawal continued until finally, at a village 60 miles from the gates of Moscow, they turned to fight what was to become the bloodiest pitched battle of the Napoleonic era, Borodino.
Borodino compares rather unfavourably with most of Napoleon's other battles. It was very much a soldier's battle, and it was a slogging match of 12 hours. Both Napoleon and Kutuzov actually played very small parts in the battle. It was noted that Napoleon was lethargic all day, and he really just seems to have launched his armies in a frontal attack against the Russians and to have left them to get on with it. He wanted to fight the Russians, he wanted to destroy their army, and he wasn't interested in any interesting manoeuvres. It was just going to be a fight, a battle of attrition to destroy the army once and for all. It was left to corps commanders, divisional commanders, brigade commanders to actually get in there and fight a soldier's battle. And it was a terrible killing match.
"75,000 casualties lay on the field, and the French had gained a mere half-mile or so of ground. Nonetheless, the superhuman effort of resistance and the appalling casualties which they had suffered caused the Russians to begin to withdraw under cover of darkness. The road to Moscow was finally open. If victory it was, the victory at Borodino was to prove a Pyrrhic success. Ironically, Napoleon now found himself the almost reluctant possessor of his enemy's religious capital. He had never intended to march this far from France. His supply situation was desperate, and he both expected and needed the Russians to daily sue for the peace which would allow him to return to France with honor before the onset of winter. On the morning of September the 14th, the French army at last arrived at Moscow to find an eerie, deserted city forsaken by its whole population. Hundreds of criminals were released. Their job was to set fire to the whole of the city in the face of a determined enemy. The Russian arsonists did their job with great thoroughness, and soon the city was ablaze.
Napoleon's army then occupied a deserted, smouldering city, and although Napoleon expected the Tsar to come to make peace terms, he waited in Moscow in vain for over a month.
The real disaster for Napoleon was that in burning the city, the Russians had furnished final proof that they would not surrender, and that the war would therefore drag on to be fought in a hostile winter 1,500 miles from France. As this awful realization dawned upon Napoleon, it was all too obvious that his position was untenable. He could not hope to feed or reinforce his depleted ranks, and the only solution was to turn for home.
By the 18th of October, when Napoleon decided to leave Moscow and begin his retreat, he had been denied the decisive battle which would have ended the campaign, and the Tsar stubbornly refused to make terms. It was on the retreat from Moscow that Napoleon's army disintegrated from a tired but disciplined force into an exhausted rabble.
As often happens when misfortune compounds misfortune, when winter arrived, it was abnormally cold and early. Added to the extremes of cold were the never-ending attentions of the Russian army and the irregular Cossacks who harried the columns and killed French stragglers in their unremitting attacks. On one occasion, even the emperor himself was under threat. As the army slowly made its way eastwards, the awful conditions of the Russian roads began to take its toll on men and transport. Already the signs were ominous. Day after day, the march dragged on to a deepening winter, with the hard-pressed French constantly under attack by Cossacks and the main Russian army never far away, ready to pounce. As the French strength in Russia dwindled, they were unable to hold onto the bridges across the mighty Brezina, and the shattered remains of the army, now a pushing, shoving mob of humanity, had to attempt a crossing on hastily constructed pontoon bridges under fierce fire from an attacking Russian force. However, what had initially been a relatively orderly crossing soon degenerated into a rout as the arrival of fresh Russian forces spread panic amongst the mass of stragglers and fugitives awaiting to cross the river with the remains of the army. As thousands clambered to cross the bridges over the icy rivers, many stragglers were pushed into the river to die instantly in the freezing waters. As panic spread, one of the two bridges collapsed, and a scene of the utmost horror unfolded, while the living trampled the dead into the lethal waters, and trapped men screamed for mercy as they froze to death.
With superhuman effort, the French were able to pass 40,000 troops and an unknown number of stragglers across the Berezina, leaving thousands of French soldiers and camp followers to their fate at Russian hands.
As the struggling mob of fugitives finally dragged itself away from the banks of the Brezina towards France and the promise of safety, it was now finally obvious that as a fighting force, the Grande Armée had effectively been annihilated. By December, there were apparently only 13,000 troops still around the colours. The remainder were a mass of dying stragglers spread out in a pathetic trail stretching for miles behind the army. Napoleon at last decided that there was little point in remaining with the crumbling remnants. He ordered the eagles of the various corps to be burned, and he took his leave of them on December the 6th. Travelling under an assumed name, he fled to Paris. For him, the ill-fated Russian adventure was finally over.
Out of a total force of 600,000 men, Napoleon returned from Russia with perhaps only 90,000. The Russian campaign then, in many respects, sealed Napoleon's fate. It proved the limits of his ambition, and it proved to the rest of Europe that not only could Napoleon be defeated, but that his Grande Armée was no longer the formidable force that it once had been.
Following his disastrous foray into Russia in 1812, Napoleon's fortunes had declined rapidly until, surrounded by armies from Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, the emperor was finally forced into unconditional abdication. In 1814, Napoleon's defeat at the hands of the Allies signalled the apparent end of the tyrant, and the nations of Europe settled down to enjoy a well-earned interlude of peace and prosperity. But it was to prove short-lived. Allowed by his enemies to retain the title of emperor, he became prince of the small Mediterranean island of Elba. From a proud army of 500,000 men, Napoleon was allowed to take with him only 600 trusted soldiers from his old guard. He personally selected these men as an emotional farewell. After choosing the men who were to be his bodyguard, the emperor called for an eagle of the old guard to be brought forward. Racked with emotion which he could scarcely disguise, Napoleon grasped it to his breast and gave it a kiss of farewell, with the words, "With this kiss, I embrace you all." Many of the grizzled veterans of Eylau, Moscow and Austerlitz, unable to bear the emotion, also broke down in tears. Shortly afterwards, the emperor took his leave of them, and on April the 28th, 1814, he boarded a British warship which was to take him to Elba and exile. He was not to be gone for long, however.
Napoleon, as the new ruler of Elba, very quickly tired of his new regime and his new empire on this tiny island in the Mediterranean, and planned to recover power in France. He was aware of the unpopularity of the new Bourbon regime, and on the 1st of March 1815, not even a year after his previous abdication, he landed on the soil of France near Caen.
Napoleon's reappearance in France and his triumphal progress from Nice to Paris has become a modern legend. Always the opportunist, Napoleon had made a legendary career from his ability to react instantly to events and opportunities. So, on February the 26th, 1815, Napoleon set sail from Elba to France for a final throw of the dice and one last chance to restore his fortunes. As Napoleon marched inland, he met a regiment which had been sent to intercept him, led by Marshal Ney, who was now the commander-in-chief of the Bourbons. But the soldiers refused to fire on him. This is one of the famous moments when he went forward from his 1,000 members of the old guard, which he had with him on the island of Elba, and opened his coat and said, "Fire if you wish." It was a tremendous act of theatre. The soldiers threw down their muskets and started to cheer, "Vive l'Empereur!" The old magic, it seemed, was too strong. And from that moment, his bandwagon was beginning to grow and continued to grow as he moved further north towards Paris. But if support for Napoleon had gained a new resilience, the response of his enemies was equally resolute. In an uncharacteristic show of solidarity, Britain, Russia, Prussia and Austria swiftly reached agreement and signed a new treaty against Napoleon. No country was to negotiate independently with him. Napoleon was not to be trusted, and above all, he was not to be allowed time to rebuild his military machine. He was to be crushed by force as soon as possible. There could be no lasting peace until Napoleon had been decisively beaten upon the field of battle.
While Napoleon offered peace to all of the powers of Europe, they were not going to be bluffed by these peace feelers, and essentially all of the main powers of Europe declared war not on France, but on Napoleon himself. They believed that it was time to rid Europe of what they termed the monster.
Faced with this coalition bent on his immediate destruction, Napoleon had no alternative but to fight the campaign which was to become known as the 100 Days, culminating in the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington, with an allied army of British, Dutch and Belgian troops, 110,000 strong, was to attack Paris from the direction of Brussels. His left flank was to be protected by Marshal Blücher, with 110,000 Prussians advancing on Namur from the direction of Liège. Napoleon's strategy for the campaign of the 100 Days, as it was always referred to, was sound strategically.
Realising the difficulty in fighting a defensive campaign in France yet again, Napoleon decided to launch a lightning strike against the two Allied armies in Belgium, Wellington's coalition of British and Dutch-Belgian troops, and Blücher's Prussian army.
Wellington was an enormously able general, highly popular with his men. Above all, he had not been beaten by the French throughout the long years of war in Spain. At 46, he was the same age as Napoleon, but suffered from none of the effects of the physical decline which troubled the emperor. Although he had a reputation for aloofness, he had a genuine concern for his men, who knew that he would not carelessly squander a single life. On occasions, he had shed very real tears over casualty reports. Nonetheless, Napoleon felt confident that he would defeat Wellington and Blücher, and his plans were further shaped by the intelligence which confirmed that due to the political differences, each of the Allied armies had a separate line of communication. Wellington's army drew supplies from England via Ostend, while Blücher's Prussians drew supplies from Germany. By striking at the hinge where the two armies joined, Napoleon hoped that when threatened, his opponents would retreat away from each other towards their supplies, making it easier for him to encircle the separate armies and defeat them in detail one after the other on equal terms. He would do this by concentrating his single army against each army in turn, giving him a local superiority of numbers at the point of decision, thus surmounting his overall numerical weakness. It was this vital need to force the Allies to retreat away from each other which was to form the focal point of all the events of the next few days. After a promising start to the campaign, crucially, Napoleon's intelligence had broken down, and he did not re-establish contact with either of his opponents until late on June the 17th.
Attempting the strategy of the central position in an attempt to divide and defeat Wellington and Blücher separately, on the 16th of June 1815, Napoleon fought the double battles of Quatre Bras and Ligny. But while Blücher's Prussian army was badly handled at Ligny, it was not decisively defeated. And while Napoleon believed that the Prussian army was retreating back to Liège and back towards the Rhine, Blücher kept his promise to Wellington and actually marched on Wavre, thus maintaining contact with Wellington's formations.
By then, Wellington had taken the fatal decision to stand and fight at Waterloo on June the 18th. He did so in the knowledge that the Prussian forces, only 8 miles away at Wavre, would be able to come to his aid that same day. Napoleon, unaware that the Prussians were so close, was confident that they were continuing to retreat, pursued by Grouchy, who had confidently assured the Emperor that he would keep the Prussian army on the move from Wellington. Accordingly, Napoleon took the decision to switch the emphasis of his attack to Wellington's undefeated army, and he personally supervised the disposition of his army on the morning of June the 18th, convinced that all he had to do was to defeat Wellington's army, and he would have time to destroy the fleeing Prussians at his leisure.
On the night of the 17th of June, then, Wellington arranged his troops to fight and die on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean near the village of Waterloo, waiting for Blücher's army to reinforce him. Only with Blücher's army could Wellington hope to stave off defeat.
As the early stages of the struggle for Hougoumont raged, and d'Erlon prepared his corps for the main French attack upon the British centre, daunting news reached the Emperor. For the first time, he learned that the Prussians were not in fact retreating towards Germany, and that they had managed to elude Grouchy. Worse still, they were on their way and would come to the aid of the British by attacking the exposed French right flank. Napoleon was therefore forced to draw off a large portion of his reserves to guard his flank before the battle had really started, and he would then have to fight with one eye over his shoulder. The Battle of Waterloo is famous for a number of episodes, including the famous charge of the Scots Greys, immortalized by Lady Butler. Equally famous is the repulse of the massed French cavalry charges by the resolute British squares, which was to prove the decisive moment of the battle. Conditions in these squares had become almost unbearable. Choked by clouds of smoke, piled high with dead and wounded, they could not hold out much longer. But by 4 o'clock, the leading elements of the Prussian army had at last reached the battlefield, and by 5 o'clock, they had captured the village of Place Noire on the French right. They were now threatening to outflank the whole French position. The Battle of Waterloo could still very easily have been won by Napoleon. Marshal Ney had at last managed to organize a series of concerted attacks, utilizing cavalry, artillery and infantry, and together they were causing huge losses in the British centre, which, worn down during a day's dogged resistance, was at last beginning to show signs of wavering.
Throughout the day, Napoleon launched a series of massive infantry and cavalry attacks in an attempt to wear down and break through Wellington's lines. Napoleon, on the morning of Waterloo, had declared that the battle would be a picnic, that Wellington was a bad general and that the English were bad troops. In fact, he had underestimated both Wellington and the nature and temper of Wellington's coalition army.
At this desperate juncture, Ney begged Napoleon for fresh troops. He knew that one last supreme effort would carry the day. Still wary of the volatile situation around Place Noire, Napoleon delayed for a crucial half an hour. Making full use of this merciful respite, Wellington was able to shore up his hard-pressed centre. It was not until 7 o'clock in the evening that Napoleon relented, and the battalions of the Imperial Guard rolled forward. The Old Guard, the oldest of the old, remained in square as a rallying point, while the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the Guard regiments, the so-called Middle Guard, assaulted the British positions. They were met by a resolute resistance by the British Brigade of Guards, who poured forth such a hail of fire that the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard, never before defeated, halted and began to give ground. Sensing that the decisive moment had come, Wellington himself urged their commander on. "Now, Maitland, now's your time," he cried. At that moment, the whole British line sprang forward almost as one man. The French will to resist seemed to crumble. As the Imperial Guard retreated, the news spread rapidly through the French ranks. "Le Gard recule!" "The Guard is retreating," was the astonished cry which carried through the ranks. But it was soon replaced with "Sauve qui peut," every man for himself. In an instant, French morale disintegrated. And by one of those sudden, strange shifts of mass consciousness, Napoleon's army was transformed from an aggressive fighting machine to a struggling mob of fugitives as panic spread throughout the army and any semblance of military discipline evaporated. The Allied pursuit was merciless, and thousands of Frenchmen were cut down, adding to the already horrendous toll of dead and wounded. The Emperor himself retreated to the safety of the rallying square formed by the Old Guard. Then, unable to force his carriage through the mob of fugitives, he was forced to take up his horse and flee the field with a small escort. Just one more panic-stricken figure in the total rout.
Napoleon's last attempt to regain the throne of France and to re-establish his empire had failed.
He left behind 47,000 dead and wounded men of both sides. The victorious Allies wanted no mistake a second time, and the Emperor was collected by a British warship and sent once more into exile. This time to the inhospitable Atlantic island of St. Helena. There he spent his last remaining days, reflecting on his former glories and turning over and over in his mind what might have been. Had Ney taken Quatre Bras? Had Grouchy arrived? Had Blücher retreated east? These were the issues to which the fallen emperor returned again and again. As his physical health and spirit declined, he was no longer the proud emperor, but already the myths were beginning to grow around him as his old soldiers slipped away one by one. But in his heart, he was still the man of great destiny, whose very name lent itself to a whole era, the age of Napoleon.